Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk about what's happening in the Russian economy. And this video is the regular monthly feature when we look at the official figures that are being published by the Ministry of Finance from Russia. So it's their data, not mine. So if you're one of those regular commentators below that says you're talking BS, this is all nonsense, you're making all of this up, you don't know what you're talking about, you can give this one a miss because these are the official figures. And as you'll know if you follow the channel, Russia is being very selective about what data it's prepared to release to the West. And if you think back to your school days, you can probably remember when you did a test and you didn't do particularly well, you weren't that keen to tell your parents about the exact result. When they asked you, you'd say, yeah, it was okay, we didn't really get a mark, yeah, let's move on. And I think it's a similar situation that we're finding with Russia. They're not wanting to release a lot of data because they don't want the West to see exactly what's going on in terms of all of the revenue that it's losing as a result of the sanctions. Russia claims that this is a security procedure, it's protocol, but I think realistically it's just a way of disguising the fact that the Russian economy is struggling right now as a result of the sanctions. And what we'll see in today's video is the details of what's happening with oil and gas revenue. And as we've seen in previous months, that is down massively compared to where Russia was before the invasion of Ukraine started. And in today's video, we'll see that that trend is continuing in the current year. We'll also have a look at what's going on with non-oil and gas revenue. And this has been the huge increase from Russia's point of view. As you'll know, if you've followed the channel, I've posted lots of videos talking about the fact that Russia has moved towards being a war economy. So a lot of companies in Russia have been commandeered and are now producing things for the war effort. And this is actually providing a boost to the economy because those companies are now reporting a huge increase in revenues. They're paying more tax. And so it looks like everybody's doing really, really well. But a lot of that business is being sponsored directly by the Kremlin. So it's a little bit circular in terms of where the money's coming from and where it's going back to. We'll also have a look at what's going on with regards to expenditure, because that has also gone up enormously as a result of the war in Ukraine. Russia is now devoting around a third of its budget to keeping the war effort going. And of course, that is costing a lot of money. And the bottom line in terms of Russia's perspective is that it's now making a loss. And this compares to the huge profits that Russia was posting before the war started. So we'll go through all of those details. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is happening right now in the Russian economy and what's likely to happen during the course of the rest of 2024. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. Really does keep me going. I know I say this in most videos and you might be getting a little bit bored of it thinking, oh, here we go again. He's thanking everybody for all of their support. But it genuinely does mean everything to me. I wouldn't keep this channel going if I didn't think that anybody was interested in watching the videos. And when I see I'm getting super thanks and buy me a coffees every single day from people, it really gives me that boost, it gives me that kick where I think I'm doing something right, I need to keep going. And the people who are providing long-term support through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee membership and YouTube membership, you're really making me think I need to make more videos. Keep these guys happy because they're supporting me. I need to keep feeding the machine and giving you what you're looking for. So thank you so much for that long-term support. Really does help to keep me going. Okay, so if you've seen one of these videos before, you'll know the drill by now. We're going to look at the official data that's been published by Russia. And if you want to find it yourself to check that I'm talking about the real numbers, you can find it at minfin.gov.ru/EN if you want to read it in English. If you want to read it in Russian, it's /RU/document. And if you scroll down to the document that was posted on the 9th of April 2024, entitled Brief Monthly Information on Federal Budget Execution, cumulative from the beginning of the year in billions of rubles. If you click into that document, you can see that we've got all of the detailed figures dating back to January 2011. Now, obviously, we're not interested in what happened back then. We're more interested in what's going on right now. If you scroll all the way over to the right, you'll find the figures for March 2024. And we've got a detailed breakdown at the top section. But obviously Russia has stopped publishing a lot of the other information. They don't want anybody to see what's going on behind the scenes, so we can't look at that. And as I've said before, rather than looking at a boring table of numbers, which does get a little bit dull, I've transposed all of these figures into some nice colourful graphs, and that's easier to see what's going on and also to compare the 4 different years that we're talking about. This graph shows the cumulative movement in Russian oil and gas revenue for 2021, 2022, 2023 and the first 3 months of 2024. 2021's figures are shown by the grey line at the top of the chart, 2022 figures are shown by the orange line in the middle, 23's figures are the blue line at the bottom, and the figures for 2024 are shown by the yellow line, which interestingly is almost identical to the orange line, so it's difficult to see. So before we dive into the detail as to what's happened in the first 3 months of 2024, I think the immediate takeaway from this chart is that Russia's best year out of the last 4 years by a country mile was 2021, the year before it invaded Ukraine. And obviously in that year, there were very few sanctions applying against Russia. There were still some sanctions as a hangover of the invasion of Crimea back in 2014. However, we didn't have the huge wave of sanctions that have been applied over the last couple of years. Russia's second best full year in terms of oil and gas revenue was 2022, which was the first year after the invasion started. Now, the first 2 months of that year were actually pre-invasion, so they were totally unaffected. And then what we saw was the sanctions being brought in over the course of the rest of 2022. So the full effect of those sanctions didn't really hit the Russian economy until 2023. And also what Russia benefited from in 2022 was that there was a huge spike in oil prices globally. And because Russia was still selling large quantities of oil to the European Union at that time, because it took time for countries to be able to change their supply chains, Russia actually had a boom in terms of revenue. And in terms of the performance in 2023, which is the last full calendar year that we're seeing on this chart, that was the worst year in terms of oil and gas revenues. And that was as a result of a combination of the sanctions being fully baked by that point. We had the oil price caps that had been introduced by the West. And also there was a dip in oil prices in 2023 as the global economy started to slow down. So Russia was hit from both sides. It was affected by the sanctions, and also oil prices generally went down. If we now have a look at what's happened in the first 3 months of 2024, you can see from the yellow line on the left-hand side of the chart that year-to-date oil and gas revenues are 2.9 trillion rubles, which equates to around $32 billion. Now, in terms of how that 2.9 trillion rubles compares to previous years, it's broadly in line with what Russia achieved in 2022, which was the first year following the invasion. It represents a 79% increase against the figures for 2023. And I'll come on to discuss exactly why there's such an increase in a moment. But when you compare the current figures to what happened in 2021, which was the last year that was completely unaffected by the sanctions, it represents a 45% fall. So basically, Russia's income from oil and gas revenues is almost half of what it was before the war started. And obviously that hasn't been adjusted for inflation. And this really shows the impact that the sanctions are having on Russia's oil and gas revenues. This chart shows the movement in the price of Brent crude oil over the last 5 years. And the reason I wanted to show this to you is to talk about why the increase in Russian oil and gas revenues in the first 3 months of 2024 are so much higher than they were in the first 3 months of 2023. At the start of 2023, the price of a barrel of oil was trading for around $79, and prices moved around wildly in the first 3 months and hit a low in March 23 of around $73. And if we look at this chart, which plots the movement of Urals oil, which is the main crude oil from Russia, you can see that the price of a barrel of Urals oil at the start of 2023 was trading for around $55. And by March 23, it had actually dropped to around $49. If we now have a look at what's happened in the first 3 months of 2024, the price of a barrel of oil started the year at a similar sort of level to where it was in 2023, at around $76. However, over the last 3 months, we have seen a significant increase in oil prices, and by the end of March, a barrel of crude oil was trading for more than $86. And if we look at what's happened to the price of Urals oil over the last 3 months, At the start of 2024, Urals was trading for around $60 per barrel, which is exactly on the price cap. However, in the 3 months to the end of March, there was a significant increase, and by the end of March, a barrel of Urals oil was trading for more than $75, which is obviously $15 above the price cap. So what we're seeing here is that in the first 3 months of 2024, Russia benefited from a general increase in oil prices compared to what was happening at the start of 2023. But in addition to that, Russia was also able to achieve prices above the price cap in the first 3 months, despite the fact that it's been set at $60 per barrel. Now, in response to that, the USA has actually turned up the heat in terms of policing those sanctions. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that over the last 6 weeks or so, there has been a huge decrease in the purchases of oil from India and China. And that's as a result of those increased sanctions. And that's now starting to reduce the price of Urals oil because Russia is struggling to be able to find buyers who are happy to pay more than $60 per barrel, because those buyers then run the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions. This chart plots Russia's non-oil and gas revenue for the last 4 years, and what we can see here is a complete reversal of the trend that we just looked at for oil and gas revenue. 2021, which is shown by the grey line at the bottom of this chart, represents Russia's worst performance out of the last 4 years. The next worst year was 2022. The second best year was 2023, shown by the blue line. And the first 3 months of 2024, which are shown by the yellow line at the top of the chart, represent a record-breaking year in terms of non-oil and gas revenue. And in terms of looking at those figures in a bit more detail, non-oil and gas revenue in the first 3 months of 24 was 5.8 trillion rubles, which means that non-oil and gas revenue is now double the amount of oil and gas revenue. So 2/3 of Russia's total revenue is now coming from non-oil and gas sources, and the figure of 5.8 trillion rubles represents an increase of 43% against the figures for 2023, a 38% increase against 2022, and a whopping 258% increase against the figures for 2021. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, this increase in non-oil and gas revenue is being driven predominantly by Russia's movement towards being a wartime economy. So Russia has commandeered lots of different companies within the country to help with the war effort. So those companies are moving away from what they were doing historically and are now producing equipment, machinery, and other items that are needed to keep the war going. And that revenue is being sponsored directly by the Kremlin. So those companies are being paid directly by the state. They don't have to worry about marketing and competition and losing customers, all of those sort of things. They've got guaranteed revenue as long as the war is going on. And that's what's driving the huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue in the first quarter of 2024. This chart shows Russia's total revenue, which is the combination of oil and gas revenue and non-oil and gas revenue for the last 4 years. And what you can see here is that we've got a real mixture in terms of performance. The figures for 2021 are shown by the grey line through the middle of the chart, which obviously represented consistent trend in terms of income delivery from Russia's point of view. The results for 2022, which is shown by the orange line, was a game of two halves. In the first half of the year, performance was very strong as a result of the fact that the sanctions hadn't really kicked in, and also there was a huge increase in oil and gas prices in the first half of the year. However, in the second half of the year, as the sanctions kicked in and oil prices started to fall, Russia suffered. And what you can see is by the end of the year, 2022 turned out to be Russia's worst year in terms of total revenue. 2023 was not a good year. The blue line starts off at the bottom of the chart in the first 6 months and only overtakes 2023 towards the end of the year. But both 2022 and 2023 were significantly worse than 2021. So at that point, the sanctions were doing what they were meant to do. They were reducing Russia's total revenue. But if you now look at what's happened in 2024, you can see that it's actually turned out to be the best year from Russia's point of view. Russia's year-to-date total revenue of 8.7 trillion rubles represents a 54% increase against the figures for 2023, a 22% increase against the figures for 2022, and a 26% increase against the figures for 2021. And the reason for this is obviously being driven by non-oil and gas revenue, which we just discussed. As a result of Russia's move to being a wartime economy, it's providing a short-term boom in revenues, and that's driving up total revenue. This chart shows the movements in Russia's total expenditure over the last 4 years, and what we've got here is a very clear and easy to understand trend. 2021 was the year when Russia spent the least on its expenditure. 2022 was the year when it spent the third highest amount. 2023 is the year when it spent the second highest amount. And the first 3 months of 2024 represent a record-breaking amount of expenditure from Russia's point of view. In the first quarter of 2024, Russia has spent more than 9.3 trillion rubles, which represents an increase of 20% against the figures for 2023, an increase of 59% against the figures for 2022, and an increase of 86% against the same figures for 2021. And of course, this continuing increase in expenditure is being driven entirely by the war in Ukraine. Russia is committing more and more capital to keeping the war going, and that means that it's spending more and more of its reserves. This chart shows the bottom line for the Russian economy over the last 4 years. So basically adding up all of the income that it's receiving and deducting all of the expenditure to see whether or not Russia is posting a profit or a loss. In 2021, the situation was very clear. In the first 11 months of the year, Russia posted a profit in every single month, and by the year end, Russia posted a total profit of 9.6 trillion rubles. As you can see by the grey line, there is a slight downward movement in the last month, and this is as a result of the fact that Russia processes a lot of its costs in the final month of the year. Obviously, it builds costs up, and rather than accounting for a lot of them on a month-by-month basis, it passes a large lump sum at the end of each financial year. If we look at the situation for 2022, which is shown by the orange line, in the first 11 months of the year, Russia posted a net profit, so it was making money. However, because of the fact that it processes a lot of its costs in December, by the year end, Russia posted a loss of 3.3 trillion rubles. And as we discussed earlier in the video, 2022 was the first year that Russia was impacted by the sanctions. So the loss that was posted really came as a result of the fact that Russia had lost a lot of oil and gas revenue. If we look at the situation for 2023, which is shown by the blue line, you can see the devastating impact that the sanctions have had on Russia's bottom line, because it posted a net loss in every single one of the first 11 months. And then because of the large lump sum of costs that are processed in December every year, the situation actually got worse. And at the end of 2023, Russia posted a net loss of 3.2 trillion rubles. If we now look at the situation in the first 3 months of 2024, you can see that Russia has posted a net loss in every single one of these 3 months. And the cumulative position at the end of the first quarter of 24 is a net loss of 607 million rubles, which is actually better than the situation for 2023, when Russia posted a net loss in the first quarter of 1.6 trillion rubles. However, it is significantly worse than 2022, when Russia posted a net profit of 1.3 trillion rubles, and compared to 2021's profit of 1.9 trillion rubles, it represents a net turnaround of over 2.5 trillion rubles. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's important to keep looking at the official figures that are being published by Russia. Obviously, this is the only live data that we're seeing coming out of the Kremlin. So we need to go through it and see exactly what's going on in terms of income and costs. And what we're seeing is a continuation of the trend that we've seen for the last 6 months or so. Oil and gas revenues continue to be significantly down against where they were before the war started, around 45% in the first quarter of 2024. And when you think about that, 45% is a huge fall. If you were running a company and you had to report sales were down 45%, your share price would be completely in the toilet. In fact, you'd probably be facing the sack. They wouldn't want you to carry on running the company. You are doing a very bad job, especially when you take into account the fact that oil and gas prices are at record highs at the moment. They've gone up a lot over the last 6 months as a result of the fact that OPEC Plus have been cutting back on their output, and also there are concerns about what's happening in both Russia and also the Middle East. So there's a lot of nervousness at the moment in terms of the oil markets, and that's obviously good news if you're an oil producer. Higher oil prices, generally speaking, means higher revenue for you. So a 45% fall in oil revenues compared to where it was in 2021 represents a disaster from Russia's point of view. But what we've also seen in today's figures is that Russia's non-oil and gas revenue has increased hugely over the past 3 months. And in fact, it's now the biggest part of the Russian economy. It's around 2/3 of total revenue. And that does seem a little bit bizarre. When you think about Russia, its main strength is the fact that it's got these huge reserves of oil and gas and other commodities. And it's been making huge amounts of profit from all of those reserves over the last 30 years. But that's not what's happening in the Russian economy right now. The main driver of the revenue in the Russian economy is coming from the war effort in Ukraine. The Kremlin is sponsoring lots of different companies, and as a result of that, they're reporting record high revenues. So despite the fact that oil and gas revenues are down by 45%, total revenue is actually at a record high. It's the highest it's been for the last 4 years, which does seem a little bit bizarre. And when you take a step back and think about what's happening, the long-term issue here is really quite concerning from Russia's point of view. Because if the war in Ukraine stopped tomorrow and the Kremlin stopped sponsoring all of these state-run initiatives, so all of these companies that are being paid to produce things in Ukraine wouldn't receive any of that income, you would have an enormous fall in revenue and a potential deep recession in Russia, because those companies have ignored what's happening with their customer base. They're no longer supplying all of the things that they were historically. And so if Russia does stop paying them for all of this war stuff, then they're going to struggle to be able to reactivate all of those sales. And in fact, a lot of their customers have probably moved on to other suppliers. And also when you take into account the fact that many of these companies will struggle as a result of the sanctions that are being applied against Russia, it's going to be difficult for them to be able to recapture their old sales. So Russia is boosting the short-term revenue by helping all of these companies and giving them guaranteed revenue. But the long-term prospects for both those companies and the Russian economy is negative. If the war stops, then all of this revenue stops, and we will see a huge fall in total revenue. Now, in terms of what's happening with expenditure, obviously Russia is devoting huge amounts of capital to keeping the war going. Around a third of the total budget is now focused on Ukraine. And what we're seeing is expenditure is at a record high. And as a result of that, Russia is continuing to post net losses. It posted net losses in the whole of 2023, and it's continued that trend in 2024. And that compares with really healthy profits that were posted in 2022 for the first quarter, and obviously for 2021, which was the year that was totally unaffected. And the problem that Russia has is when it continues to post net losses, it's having to fund those losses. Those losses are coming from national reserves, and obviously there's a finite amount of capital in those reserves. Russia can't go on funding these losses forever, because at some point those reserves will run out, and therefore it won't be able to carry on funding it. So the overall summary of today's video is that at face value, it looks like Russia is doing quite well. Total revenue is up. In fact, it's at the highest level that it's been for the last 4 years. But when you dig down into the details as to what's happening, you can see that there has been a huge fall in oil and gas revenue, which has been Russia's mainstay for the last 30 years, and a huge increase in war economy revenue, which is obviously a short-term issue. It can't carry on forever. It will only continue as long as the war goes on. And the expenditure on the war is still hugely expensive. It's causing Russia to make losses. Those losses mean that Russia is having to dive into its reserves, and at some point those reserves will run out. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.